friends, today you will see the promised interview with Bunsuke. In case you don't know him, he has been learning Japanese for 18 years and he lived in Japan for 6 years. In 2012, he passed the N1 and he also recently finished his PhD in Japanese literature, which he wrote in Japanese, which is mind-blowing. And at the moment, he's teaching Japanese to intermediate and advanced learners with a reading-based approach. Today, we're discussing topics like pitch accent, reading and speaking on my channel. And we're also discussing JLPT strategies, how to learn online versus offline, and also how to surpass the intermediate plateau on his channel. So don't forget to check out the second part of the video on his channel after you watched this one. The videos are a bit longer than usual, so feel free to make yourself a coffee or a tea or also listen to it as a podcast. And without further ado, let's start. The first question is, what inspired you to adopt a reading-based approach to teaching Japanese, and what are the key advantages over other methods in your opinion?
I come from a university that's very conservative, so people did a lot of classical Japanese studies. I was more interested in Meiji, which was modern back then, but now people tend to classify it as Shinkoten Bungaku, so new classical Japanese literature. I think because of that background, I've always had kind of a love of reading, and I always felt that that was kind of a gateway. And I just think it's great because it's a never-ending learning cycle. And if you want to read contemporary literature, then of course you're getting the kinds of phrases and words that are used nowadays, so that you can kind of also hone your vocabulary that's actually useful. But then if you want to go back and see how certain words developed, you can just go back like a decade with each book that you read. The reason I choose it, let's say, over spoken language in my lessons is that I feel, even though my spoken Japanese is fine, I think, you can just get a native speaker for that. I can do it, and I feel there wouldn't be such a big difference between a native speaker and myself when it comes to conversation classes for, let's say, intermediate learners. But I don't think my added value is in speaking. I think it's in reading. And it's because I feel that a lot of the native teachers, online teachers, focus mostly on beginners and early intermediate conversation. And so there's no place to turn if you are upper intermediate and you want to do more. So chances are that your conversation at that point is already pretty decent, but it's always very difficult to get better at reading. I just wanted to make a platform for people who, after, let's say, Genki Minna no Nihongo or N3, N2, want to go beyond that. And my own field is Japanese literature, so I felt that was the most logical point of entry. I'm also the most credible, I guess, as a teacher in that area.
Definitely. Yeah. Great. And what do you think, what are the advantages of using a reading-based approach via a typical lesson where you learn grammar, vocabulary? Yeah. Because
in reading, everything comes up, right? You have vocabulary, you have reading, you have to read out loud, you have kanji, and usually I go beyond the text when I teach. So we would just go through a sentence and then really dissect the structure of the sentence. If it's a longer sentence, how do you approach the sentence? Where do you break it down? What belongs to what? Who is speaking? A lot of people struggle with kind of who's doing what in the sentence. So we approach those things, and then we go into kanji and vocabulary. And then I also go into kind of any vocabulary or kanji that are adjacent to the words that come up. And so you get a huge spectrum with, things that you can learn or pick up from just one sentence. And other people, they just want to read and they don't want to kind of dig that deep. And so then we go a bit faster. But I think if you're learning grammar and vocabulary and kanji in order to read, then for me, the order in which to learn those is by reading and then looking up what comes up, instead of learning books, like buying a vocab book and learning the vocabulary and then hoping that it comes up somewhere. So for me, reading is kind of the only approach that really makes sense. So people that come to me for lessons usually are people that want to read.
Yeah.
And if you want to read, then the only way to become good at that skill is to read. That's basically it. Yeah.
And what does a typical lesson look like with your students?
Yeah, so it's usually about 55 minutes and always one-on-one. And I always let the student choose the text. If they don't have a text that they want to read, I'll pick one. But sometimes during the reading, they'll already say like, oh, this is too easy, too difficult. And then we can really switch quickly to something else. I have the student read out the sentence, and then we go through the meaning, and then we go through the structure. And usually when you have to translate a sentence, I can pick up where people are going wrong. I always ask them, so, okay, why do you take this approach? And then we can discuss which approach would be better or more effective if you're dealing with, let's say, a long sentence or shorter sentence, but with more abstraction or maybe difficult vocabulary. So we discuss it on all different levels. You know, sometimes in other cases, we do like a how do I use a kanji dictionary lesson. And yeah, it's stuff like that we do. It can be anything. Some people prefer to speak in Japanese during the lesson, so we do it in Japanese. Most people prefer English. But I also have some Japanese native speakers, like Japanese people who take my lessons. And then it's more about how to read and interpret the piece of literature as literature. That can be whatever that person wants.
And like if you are the one choosing the text, do you have any specific criteria, or like how do you decide what you are going to like use in the lesson?
I usually only work with people who are a bit upper intermediate or higher. I send them a text usually by Miyazawa Kenji because he writes children's stories, but they're also kind of enjoyable for adults. I basically say that, okay, if you can get through this text without too much trouble, then you are at the level that I'm looking for. And then if they say it's too easy, we can always switch. A more modern might be Akagawa Jirou. It's kind of a mystery writer who is quite accessible. And, you know, if you're not completely drowning in a text like that, where you don't understand anything, you don't know any of the kanji, the grammar, then usually I take on that student. Usually I do like a semester-based thing or like 12 sessions. And then we read something difficult in the first session that is kind of a struggle. And then I take it down a notch from the second session. And then we build from there to end up where we started in the first lesson, so people can really feel how they've progressed. And then at session 12, they can kind of palpably feel how they've grown and how that struggle through the text has helped them grow, because a lot of the issues they felt in session 1 will have resolved themselves in session 12.
It's definitely a great way of comparing like how far you've come, like outside of the JLPT universe.
Yeah.
I think like this is also like for people who don't want to use only reading, but maybe listening, a great idea, like to just use the thing you used at first, just go back and see how easy it has become.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to feel that you're actually making progress. And you can even kind of do it very consciously, right? So mark the date on something that you find very difficult. And then a year later, go back to it and see what's happened in the meantime. I think that if you've put in consistent work, it doesn't have to be hours and hours each day. You can just do like 15 minutes, half an hour. But if you're doing that consistently and with your full attention, the only way is up, right? You'll notice a difference after a while. If you have a tutor that guides you through that text, then I think the leap will be even bigger, because you can ask all your questions, the things that you kind of feel you understand, but maybe not completely. But what about you? What kind of approach do you prefer?
You mean with reading or like in general?
You said that you're plateauing not so much, but you're getting bored in your studies. What kind of things would you want to do with the language? How do you see yourself using the language over the next few years? And how do you think you want to achieve that?
So, of course, I talked about wanting to go to language school in Japan. This will be in October next year, probably. Until then, I would really like to be able to communicate. So this is a thing that I really want to learn and I really want to get good at. And this is also the topic we are discussing later. So I will talk a bit more like later about this.
Sure.
And I also love reading, but I oftentimes find it hard to find comprehensible input because I've been mostly reading along the Mini Immersion book club, like over on the Mini Immersion server. And there is a beginner club, but it's not only like lower beginner, it's also like upper beginner and sometimes even like up to N3 maybe. And I kind of I struggled a lot in the beginning. I didn't even finish the book, like in the time we had. but I still managed to see an improvement, even though it was always a bit too complicated for me. But I would like to find like really comprehensible things now, because I also feel like getting tired of looking so much up and not really understanding. But yeah, I also want to be able to express my feelings. Like this is definitely something I would like to achieve, like until I go to Japan.
No, I completely get it. And I think if you have a few more months left, like a year left until you go, I think that's definitely an achievable goal. And I think that if you put in that work before you leave, then during your stay, you'll see like an exponential grow in your abilities as well.
Yeah,
so
I hope so.
Very excited for you that you can go. Yeah.
I'm too. I also got myself like some phrase books. Like I also put some here for like decoration.
Like,
yeah, this is actually for Japanese people who want to learn like English, but there's also good. Like, of course, English translation for the Japanese. And like, it's really fun because like I can just learn it the other way around.
Yeah.
And I also heard from another girl who was also in language school like this year that it really helped her, like even when she was in Japan, to understand more of the usual conversation kind of things. Because she also told me that it's a whole different thing, like listening to like a podcast or speaking yourself. But if you are in a situation where two people are speaking, or like where you want something from a cashier, for example, then it's definitely different. And
it's very different.
Harder to understand.
This is something I experienced in Japan as well. I mean, the first year that I went, I was part of a program, and the university took us all to the hospital to get a checkup, and it was kind of on rotation. So you didn't have to say anything. You just have to stand there and get measured for your weight or blood pressure or whatever. They all take you to the bank, and all you have to do is sign something, and you have a bank account. Everything's taken care of for you. At the moment, I kind of had to find my own apartment and deal with the gas company and go to the hospital myself and explain what was going on. These are all kinds of very different situations that you can only learn when you're in that situation. I've also noticed that even though I was there for 6 years, there are still situations that I've never been in. Like I've never had children in Japan, let's say. So I don't know what it's like to communicate with a kindergarten. I've just noticed that, certain things you get only by being in that situation. If you're not in that situation, it doesn't matter how long you study, you won't get that vocabulary until you put yourself in a situation like that.
And when it comes to reading again, in your experience, what are the common challenges that your students face when they are adopting your approach? And what are your tips or strategies that you help them overcome their struggles?
I think the most practical tip I have is that I often notice, especially if the sentence is very long, people start to translate or try to interpret the sentence from the beginning of that sentence. You will definitely get lost because your mind wants a verb, and that doesn't happen until the end of the sentence, or at least the middle of the sentence. And so people jump a lot within that sentence, and then they end up with these segments that they haven't dealt with yet, and they don't know how to place them. The sentence ends up not making sense, or actors or the agents within the sentence or the subject and the object will be kind of jumbled up. The best tip I can give somebody who's struggling with long sentences is just go to the end and translate backwards little bit by little bit. And if you do that, it still won't be a very beautiful translation, but at least you won't miss anything, and you'll have a much better sense of what does what in the sentence. And then you can kind of reassess one more time. That always really, really helps. And that's the most common, not mistake, but kind of intuition that people have.
And how do you address the balance between like reading, speaking, listening, and writing, like in your study approach?
For myself, I make sure that I consume a large variety of media. I read a lot of literature, but I also read a lot of essays. Sometimes I read the news. Of course, that's already different. But then I watch a lot of very crappy Japanese variety shows, YouTube, like interviews. And then I speak a lot myself. I have a lot of Japanese friends. I speak Japanese at home, at university. And basically, it's harder for me to keep my Dutch at the same level than
I can relate.
Practice my Japanese.
German.
Sometimes I make up Dutch words without knowing it. I say things that don't exist.
Yeah, same. It's with like English and German. Like I consume so much English and speak so much in English that sometimes like my grammar in German is really shitty. And even when I'm at work, like communicating with customers, I'm like, oh God, they must think I'm really dumb because I can't construct like a basic sentence in German. One customer once asked me because I asked her, what is this word in German again? And she was like, you're not German. And I was like, no, I am German, but I don't know German anymore.
I had the same experience the other day. I was taking a cooking class, like an Indian cooking class. And then all of the other participants were Dutch as well. But then I was talking about, living abroad and living in the United States and living in Japan. And then one of the other participants said, but your Dutch is really good. It's almost as good as a native speaker. And then I turned to her and I said, I am Dutch. What do you mean almost as good as a native speaker? Apparently I have an accent, and then they think I'm either not Dutch or have lived abroad for a long time. Usually I get American, but I have an R, like a R in my Dutch, which is very common in the place that I was born. And so, but people think that's an American R. I often get, I'm not a native speaker, which is kind of, I feel lost. I don't have a home. I can't be fully Japanese. I'm definitely not an English native. Apparently also not a native speaker in Dutch. So I have no place to go.
I think this is probably like a big problem, like polyglots face. Like I wouldn't consider myself one, but I mean poly means more than two probably. So
yeah, I guess so. Yeah.
Maybe I am, and maybe you are as well. So yeah, I think this is like quite common that you are forgetting your mother tongue kind of.
Maybe, yeah, it's possible.
And when it comes to reading again, can you share some like stories or testimonials from your students who improved their Japanese through your approach?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think it's better to ask the students themselves because I don't want to put words in their mouths. But from my perspective, they're not afraid of the text as they maybe were at the beginning. And also their ability to comprehend and pick up stuff improves over kind of the 12 weeks that I work with them. Some students I've been working with for over a year, and then you can really see a big jump from when they started. Part of it is, of course, the structure of the lessons, but in the end, it's the students who put in the hard work. I'm just there to facilitate it, because if people don't do the work, then I can teach what I want, but it's not going to work. The lessons serve to expedite that learning process. I can really see how people pick it up and then no longer worry about sentence structure, vocabulary that they don't know. They're kind of comfortable with not knowing everything.
What are some good resources for people that are saying now, oh, I want to try this approach? Like, what would you recommend?
Well, I always go to Aozora Bunko because it's free. But I guess the drawback of Aozora Bunko is that the texts are a bit older. So finding texts that are readable and kind of up to date, but also free, that's a bit of a struggle. I actually suspect that people of your, let's say, generation, who are much more into kind of internet resources will probably know a lot more about this than I do. And if I really want something, I order it on Japanese Amazon. Like I said, Miyazawa Kenji is good, but then if you want more modern writers, I imagine this might be a struggle if you were kind of lower intermediate, but upper intermediate should be okay, where it's enjoyable and you learn a lot. I'm reading Yamada Eimi now. She's really funny and quite hardcore. Even in the internal dialogue of the protagonist, there's a lot of speaking like you would speak as in conversation. So I think it's useful for that as well. A lot of people read Murakami Haruki, but I'm not a huge fan. And there's a lot of authors nowadays that are not Japanese, or they're Japanese, but they have multicultural backgrounds. I always like Tawada Yoko, who's really fantastic. It's not easy to read, but it's definitely not as hard as Soseki or Moriogai. So that might be a place to go. But again, if those are too hard for you, don't feel pressured into thinking, oh, I should have reached this level a long time ago because Bunsuke said I should be able to read this. It's like, well, don't worry if it's still too hard. But if that's the kind of stuff that you want to be able to read, you can always reach out to me or join a community that helps you kind of push through the hard times.
That sounds great. I actually also made a video about like a lot of free reading resources. So I will also make sure to link it like somewhere down or below.
Oh, yeah. I should watch that video then, because I can recommend it to my students.
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah.
And what are some books that were most important to your own growth in reading in Japanese?
Oh, that's good. That's a great question. So a few books stand out. So the first one is the book by Murakami Haruki that I mentioned in the beginning. I think the title is Kagirinaku Tomei ni Chikai Blue. I think it's one of his first works. I still remember it to this day because it was kind of my first venture into actual Japanese literature. Another one I would say that really stands out for me is Soseki's Sorekara, which is a novel. It's not too long. That really stands out for me because I wrote my MA in Japanese about that novel, and I spent so much time going over it. I even went over Soseki's own handwritten manuscript of that book. So that I still have very special memories when it comes to that book. Maybe this answer is not completely what you had in mind when you asked the question. Kind of in my career and also in my development as a person who does work with literature, these were some of the books that really stood out for me because they helped me progress to the next level, for sure. Yeah.
Great. We will also make sure to link everything down below so that everyone can also
let's do it. Yeah.
What are some good resources for learning about Japanese history and culture, preferably in English? Because I know not everyone is as far in their Japanese level that they can read it in Japanese.
Oh, that's also a good question. I can show you the books that I used in my first year, but those will be very outdated. Maybe there are updated editions now. So the books that I used in my first year, and so keep in mind, this is 18 years ago. And so they're a bit dry, but if you were just looking for decent overviews of Japanese history and culture, there's this book called Japanese Culture by Paul Varley, which is a solid introduction. And Andrew Gordon wrote A Modern History of Japan. Those are well-structured, very sound introductions, but they're a bit, academic and a bit dry. There's a series that's from the late 80s, early 90s. I'm not really sure what it's called, but it's completely on YouTube, but it was made during the Japanese economic bubble. It's a Japanese language course for people who have never studied Japanese, and it's kind of aimed at tourists. But it's a very solid course. So if you're a very, very beginner and you want to learn some Japanese phrases, that's a good place to start, even though it's a bit outdated. But why I still kind of enjoy watching that is because of the historical glimpse of what it was like to live in that period in Japan. And it might be just enjoyable for me because I was already somewhat alive during that period, but it's just very funny to see.
I think that's probably a very fresh perspective, even though it's a bit older, but nothing you would get recommended elsewhere, for example. So I think not a lot of people might know this one.
I think I recommended it once through my newsletter and 3 people responded saying, yeah, I still remember this course. And it's like, oh, we're the same age. Yeah. And it's past the point of being outdated. And it's now at the point where it's retro. So it's kind of cool.
So let's move on to probably the hardest skill to master in Japanese speaking.
Is it the hardest skill? I'm not sure. Yeah, maybe.
I don't know. At least I get the impression all the time that people struggle a lot with speaking because especially us European learners, Japanese is so far from our native language. English is totally fine. It's not that big of a difference kind of. But because of all the sounds you have to make in Japanese, I think people are a bit intimidated.
Okay.
Or do you think do you have another impression?
My impression is that the sounds are usually not the biggest problem. Also, that getting fairly decent at Japanese because the grammar is quite simple compared to Russian or Finnish or something like that. Yeah, but even German is already more complicated than Japanese, right?
True. All the cases.
All the cases. Yeah. Getting fairly decent at basic conversation is quite easy in Japanese, actually. But then getting to the point where you can express yourself freely in non-formal settings where you're making friends, I think that's very difficult. And I feel that a lot of the culture on internet surrounding speaking in Japanese is now about having perfect pitch accent and
definitely.
sounding like a native speaker, right?
Yeah. What's actually your opinion on pitch accent?
My opinion is that it's important in the sense that, it is easier for a native speaker to listen to you if you speak closer to the way they speak, which is true for any language, I think. Depending on the pitch, sometimes the meaning can change as well. But having said that, I also feel that part of the kind of toxic learning environment that you were speaking about of earlier is that you have to have perfect pitch. Otherwise, you won't be able to make friends in Japan. And I completely disagree with that.
Yeah.
Because, there are all kinds of learners. There are people who speak fluent Japanese who don't have perfect pitch. And like TV personalities that have been in Japan since the 80s, like Dave Spector or something like that. He doesn't have perfect pitch. He sounds a bit foreign. I think the reason for him being on television is because he's a foreigner, but he can say whatever he wants in Japanese and nobody goes like, huh, what the hell did you say? I don't think he worries about being able to make friends in Japan, right? And so
Definitely.
I think it's important and it's interesting as well to think about and to study, but I don't think it's so important that people have to be anxious about it. Because I sometimes also make pitch accent mistakes, and when I'm tired, I make more mistakes, and it doesn't matter because my friends will still be my friends. Maybe they'll laugh a little bit or they're like, oh, your Japanese is weird today, but then that's it, right? Even within Tokyo, there's kind of pitch accent differences. And then if you go just into Saitama, it's already different. So I was in Osaka for a while, but I go to Tohoku and I go to Kyushu a lot as well. And that's that's a different language, right? And you can't say that those people aren't native Japanese just because they don't speak perfect Tokyo-ben style. And it is true that as a person that doesn't look like a native speaker, you are maybe more harshly judged on the way you speak, or people will kind of look for mistakes to prove that you're not as good as people say you are. I always notice in my own Japanese, if people treat me as a foreigner who doesn't know anything about Japan, then I will also start speaking like that. I don't know why this happens. I was at a hotel once and they spoke to me like a tourist who kind of spoke a little bit of Japanese. But then I started speaking like a tourist who only knew a little bit of Japanese. For some reason, I had like a mental block.
Yeah.
And I couldn't say the words properly anymore.
Yeah.
So it does happen to me as well. But then something switched in my head and I went back to my normal Japanese. And then it was kind of, maybe I should have addressed them in a different way, and then everything was okay. And I've had that happen many times in Japan where they think foreigners have different treatment standards. If you are kind of firm, you can really take a stance and then say, no, this is not the way I want to be treated, then it should be fine. I think it helps if you have good pitch when you do that. It's interesting to study. If you want to do it, do it. I do it too. I kind of study it. I have multiple pitch accent dictionaries. I really like comparing intonations and then also comparing intonations between dialects. Even Japanese people amongst each other, if you come from the countryside and you have an accent, people come to Tokyo, they will try to repress their accent in order to not sound like somebody from the inaka.
Yeah, to fit in.
So the pressure is on for Japanese people amongst themselves as well, even though it's a different kind of pressure. But still, as long as you're able to communicate with people and have a good time and are respectful, I think pitch accent is not the most important thing on the Japanese language learners list of things to do.
I think it definitely also depends like what you want to do. Because like, for example, in my case, I don't plan on living in Japan. I just want to go there like for fun and maybe for extended periods of time, but like just to experience the country. And I also noticed like when I was able to say like a few Japanese words, even the people at the convenience store, they were so amazed that I could say something.
Right.
I don't think they even cared like if I had the pitch accent right or not. Like they probably barely understood me, but they were like, oh my God, you speak Japanese. This is so cool.
Yeah, that already really helps, right? It's a real icebreaker. I always notice it in restaurants as well when they give you an English menu. And if I'm with my Dutch friends who also speak Japanese, by the way, and come in and they see 3 tall Dutch people sitting down, you can really feel that the chef is getting nervous. Like, oh, how am I going to get through this? It's always a nice moment when you go like, oh, we speak Japanese. And you go like, oh, thank God.
Yeah, that's true.
And so people are just really happy that you are able to communicate.
And how did you actually start to develop your speaking skills? Because you told me you have more like a reading-based approach. What were your first steps?
So my first steps were finding Japanese people in my direct environment and then hanging out with those people as much as I could, doing activities or watching shows together. Even if you're not speaking with them, just being in a group where Japanese is being spoken is already helpful. And then I would kind of try to pick up things from their conversation that are kind of general statements or what kind of phrases that you can use in different situations. And then I would write those down at the end of the evening if I still remembered them, and put them in my like phrase book that I was editing by myself. And then I would remember those phrases and try to use them the next time I would see them. And that really helped me in language exams, like speaking exams at university. You know, of course, you have to remember all of the vocab and the phrases from the actual textbook. But if you had like native level kind of set phrases that you could insert in the conversation with your teacher that are not in the book, they would be so impressed. Like, how does this guy know? And if I had like 3 of those in a 10-minute exam, they would be completely convinced that, you know, oh, this person is a genius who's done much more work than is expected of him. And so I always got really high marks because of that. In the beginning, the only thing you can really do is emulate what's in your direct environment. So you can just copy what people are saying in certain situations. And that's what I try to do to the best of my abilities. And if I learned a new word but was unsure how to use it, I would just use it and gauge their reaction to how I said it. And if they would go like, then I knew I'd made a mistake. But if they would answer normally, I was like, okay, that's apparently how you use that. And I would kind of try to categorize everything in my head as I was doing it.
So you experimented a bit?
Oh, all the time. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Also with weird words that I knew probably wouldn't be right for that context, but then I wanted kind of an occasion to ask people about that word. So I would use it and they would go like, well, that's not how you use that. It's like, oh, really? How do you use that word? And then they would explain it to me. It's like, oh, it's more like this. You always get a better answer that way than when you just simply ask, I've learned this word. How do you use it? Because even when people ask me about Dutch, I'll come up with some weird grammar book type of sentence that you would never actually use in Dutch. You come up with a sentence like, the man went to the grocery store to buy milk, or something like that. And it was like, never in the history of kind of the human race has that sentence been uttered seriously in a real conversation. And so, but if you are engaged in conversation and you try things out, and then it comes back to you in positive or negative ways, then you can kind of categorize that for yourself.
Yeah, that basically sounds like a great idea, but I feel like for most people, it would probably be way too out there, like especially for the people who are more anxious about like starting to speak, because like searching like a group of Japanese people and speaking to them must be really intimidating, because I know a lot of people even struggle to just talk to one Japanese person, even if it's a teacher, for example. Like, what are your tips on how do you overcome this like anxiety?
Well, I was also very anxious. And I think speaking to a group of Japanese people is easier than speaking to one Japanese person.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, because the group among themselves also interact. So sometimes you're not the focus point. So if you're in front of a group of Japanese people speaking to the group, that's intimidating. But usually that's not how it works, right? You just go out with everybody. You speak to one person to this side, then a person to this side, or sometimes you kind of fade out of the conversation. People just talk amongst themselves. And then I could kind of regroup. But I was nervous throughout the entire process, for sure. It took years for me to get comfortable. But I also noticed that if I don't get uncomfortable, then I would not progress, at least not as fast. So I get the anxiety that people experience, and that it's very, very scary. And also at some point you notice that not everybody is interesting because they're Japanese. Sometimes you think, oh, this is not a person that I want to hang out with because of their attitude or beliefs, or just because they're boring or they don't have the same interests. And in the beginning, so everybody, because they're Japanese, you think, oh, this person is interesting because now I can practice my communication skills with this person. At some point, you also kind of develop a deeper connection with people beyond kind of this cultural difference, and you just want to hang out. And then communication has to be had because of that common interest, right? So if you practice the same sports, or, you know, you like a certain activity, and then within that setting, you can say things to each other in whatever language you choose.
And are there any particular resources you found helpful when developing your speaking skills? Because you also talked about like listening to a lot of things, watching a lot of movies, shows. Nowadays,
I use the website miyomio.guru.
Okay.
Because that has all the shows. And sometimes because of the Chosakuken Mondai, they change websites or extensions. Usually I watch all of my shows there, and I think they also have a different sister page that links to that for dramas. Just shadowing from there or picking up phrases and sentences is also very helpful. If you're a very, very anxious person who doesn't necessarily crave that direct interaction, that might be a good way to go about it.
In your opinion, what are the most common mistakes language learners make when speaking Japanese?
Oh, well, one thing I noticed, and I was very guilty of this in the beginning as well, is people try to translate humor from their own cultural setting into Japanese, and it never works. Humor doesn't translate well between cultures, I've noticed. Let's keep it out of the conversation. That's also the most difficult part, is getting good at humor in Japanese. If you can make people laugh, you're on your way.
Of course, listening is a really big part of speaking as well, because for communicating, you not only have to speak, but you also have to know what the other person said to you. Is there a secret tip you have for enhancing your listening abilities?
Not a secret tip, really. Do you also have this experience where I always understand Japanese better when it's spoken to me directly rather than when I'm listening in on somebody else's conversation? I don't know why that is. Maybe I'm just bad at focusing on the people's conversations, but I always feel that when people are looking at me and speaking to me, it always hits me more directly than other people's conversations.
Probably because it's a more stressful situation, because you're the focus point.
I'm really curious how you practice now, because I haven't practiced listening as listening for the longest time. I think it's been 15 years or something like that. So after my first year in Japan, the first 3 months were tough, because I really had to focus. Everybody was speaking in Kansai Ben. Even the teachers, they didn't care. They was like, we're from Kansai, we're going to teach in Kansai Ben. There was a struggle at first, but then after about 3 months, I noticed that I was able to relax, and I didn't have to listen so intently anymore to get the gist of what was being said. So I don't really remember if I did anything special, and now I just listen, and I usually get it, and if I don't, I just look it up. How do you go about, learning? Because you haven't been in Japan for a longer period of time. So how do you go about it, and what kind of resources do you use? Because I think a lot of people watching my channel can also really benefit from this as well.
Well, I'm not the best at practicing listening, because I tend to avoid things that I don't feel comfortable with, like a lot of self-learners do, I think. But I try to push myself to do it more, because I realized, like with taking JLPT and almost failing the listening section, that I have to do something about it, because if I want to progress and if I want to have a great experience in Japan, I want to be able to understand and also to communicate. So I try to listen to podcasts regularly, 1 or 2 episodes a week at the minimum. I listen to the Japanese with Shun podcast. He's actually a Japanese tutor, so he also takes on like beginner students and like lower intermediate students. And he does a lot of like really short podcast episodes. He's kind of basing the difficulty on the Genki books, like the basic topics you would have at the start, but it's getting more advanced now, like traveling to a specific country, or in the not so great times, like 2 years ago. He also did a lot of podcasts about that. I think it's a really great resource, because he also has the transcript for his podcasts, but you have to be a Patreon to get those. But he talks really slowly, and he also has vocabulary explanation at the end. So if he uses really out there vocabulary that you wouldn't know as a beginner or lower intermediate, then he will also like kind of translate it and give you an example sentence in Japanese where you could use this word. So I think it's a really good way to learn. And at first I really struggled to keep up. My brain would zone out like within 30 seconds, and I didn't know what he was talking about. But now I'm on like episode like 40 or 50, and now I can really follow his explanations. Of course, I still zone out sometime through the podcast, but then I will just listen to it again and try to like focus a bit more. Yeah, focus is still something I struggle with a lot. And I also want to try to find like other podcasts, so that I have a variety of different voices I can listen to and not only learn from one person. There's also the Ask Japanese YouTube channel, and it's actually also like a German who does interviews with Japanese people on the street.
He always is in kind of cosplay.
Yeah. And I really like this for a more like advanced listening practice, or like upper intermediate probably, because I can catch different words, and they also have subtitles in English, so I can kind of match the Japanese to the subtitles, like the parts that I don't know. I think it's a good challenge, like when you are around like my level, like the N4 and 3 level, because at first I also didn't know like anything they were talking about. But today I listened to a few videos and I was like, oh, I can understand something.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. Oh, those moments are so important, right? Where you feel that, I've made progress. I understand stuff now. Yeah, that's great. I usually don't listen to podcasts at all, but I really enjoy the one that everybody seems to enjoy, Yuru Gengo Gaku Radio. It's a little bit more high level, and they talk about aspects of Japanese that are interesting, but it's not geared towards foreign learners. It's for Japanese people. So it's a bit higher level, but it's interesting, and they don't talk too fast, I feel. I always find it quite fascinating. And it's a kind of a conversation where one plays the dumb one, where it's like, oh, I've never heard of that, tell me more. And the other one has done the work of, finding out more about that specific word or phrase or kanji or whatever.
Yeah, I also use like a lot of Netflix shows to practice my listening, to do it in a more relaxed manner. Like when I'm just chilling with my boyfriend, for example, because he's not learning Japanese, I will just put on the German subtitles for him and I will listen to the Japanese audio and also try to match the audio to the subtitles. I really like Love Village, Love Bus, Terrace House, like the typical like kind of dating shows, because they have a really good vocabulary for even beginners and lower intermediates. So I think this is also a good way to start like listening to more like native content.
For sure. Yeah. I always like those shows as well. Not for listening, just to relax. It's always good. I always like Shinya Shokudo as well, about this patron who has a midnight restaurant that starts, I think, at 12 and then ends in the morning.
Is this called like Midnight Stories or something?
Yeah, it's Midnight something. It only has 2 seasons and now it's ended, unfortunately.
That's always sad. Do you have any words of like encouragement or inspiration to like people who are now more inspired to study even more Japanese, or they want to become like proficient?
I don't think I have that much wisdom to share, but I always feel that just don't be afraid to kind of make your own plan when it comes to learning any language, not just Japanese. But I think this goes back to what we discussed in the beginning, where if you're in the language learning community online a lot, then that community will automatically kind of almost unconsciously dictate how you have to learn and which goals and you have to kind of work towards. And JLPT N1 is one of those goals, and people who have passed N1 are kind of the leaders of the pack, and then everybody has to aspire to become like them. And I think it's fine if you don't really feel that that's for you. There are other online spaces that will work for you. You just have to find your crowd, and once you do, I think you'll notice immediately, because it just feels like a better fit. It just takes time. I know it can be excruciating to learn Japanese sometimes, and it just takes such a long time. Every step that you take feels like you're taking 3 steps back. If anything, I'm living a proof that it's possible, and that even after 18 years, it can still be enjoyable to study this. I think it's a mistake to think after a certain time, I'll be done, right? There is no done. It just takes time. And then after that time, you feel, oh, actually, I can keep going longer and longer. I guess the best advice that I can give is enjoy the process as much as you can and just go your own way and find people who are on the same page as you to share that journey with. What about you?
Well, along those lines, please don't put yourself under so much pressure, because like as we discussed before, there is no like size fits all and no perfect plan to arrive where you want to arrive. So just try to take more time for your goals. Don't stress yourself out with like needing to pass the JLPT, and try to look like around your like current study plan or like study resources. Try to see what else is out there. Maybe there's even something that you would enjoy more and even have more fun, and that would add to your life and your like overall enjoyment.
That's great advice.
Yeah, thank you so much for taking
the time. Yeah, this is a great talk. I hope everybody enjoys this, and if they do, that they will like the videos on both channels and tell us, because that really helps us and encourages us to keep going. If there's anything you want us to discuss either separately or together, then please let us know in the comments. I had a great time. Thank you so much.
Yeah, me too. Yeah. Thank you so much. I also got like a few questions about like your time in Japan, etc. But we've already gone on for 2.5 hours today, so I will save them for a later time.
Yeah, we already have like the topic for next time then.
Yeah.
That sounds great. Thank you so much for today. Don't forget to subscribe to both our channels so you keep up to date.
Yeah.
And see you in the next video.
See you. Bye bye.